Hello, intellectonauts. Earlier today, I had an exploratory stroll with Michael Millerman. Michael is a doctor in political science, and he received his PhD recently from the University of Toronto, where he studied political theory. He is one of the world's leading experts on Alexander Dugin and has translated many of Dugin's writings into English. I discovered Dugin sometime this past summer and was researching a bit on him, mainly his influence on the geopolitical world scene. I don't really know much about Dugin, so this conversation was an opportunity for me to learn more, and I believe it provided an excellent 101 on Dugin's thought. I really enjoyed this conversation, and it dawned on me how nuanced Dugin's thought really is. And this idea of the dark logos. Maybe it's just my superficial attraction to how cool it sounds, but there's something about it that I'm going to have to think about further. So while I noodle on the dark logos, enjoy this exploration I had with Michael Millerman. This is a club for lovers of Sophia, cartographers of the noosphere, anthropologists of memeplexes, addicts of insight porn, and rebels full of viewquakes. We are not idealists or realists, theists or atheists, modernists or postmodernists, liberals or conservatives, progressivists or reactionaries. We may be a mix of all of these things, but first and foremost, we are intellectual explorers. Today, we are going on an exploratory stroll with Michael Millerman. I'm now going to anchor myself in an exploratory mindset via spoken affirmation. I, Peter, will engage in this dialogue with the spirit of exploration. My intention is not to agree or disagree, but to be a performative agnostic and understand my interlocutor's map of reality and possibly explore new territory together and joyfully anticipate what we might discover. That being said, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're one of the world's leading experts on Alexander Dugin. And Big Think released an article a while ago calling him the most dangerous philosopher in the world. And when you and I spoke last, we were talking about the importance of having a philosophical sandbox and sandboxing all sorts of ideas, even dangerous ideas. So my first question is, assuming if Dugin's ideas are dangerous, what's the importance of philosophically sandboxing potentially dangerous ideas?
Well, it's important to think through the issues that matter to us. And if we're thinking about political life or human life, that means thinking beyond the boundaries of what seems to us acceptable, customary, orthodox, in the sense of being commonly regarded as the legitimate boundaries or confines of the issue. And you can define, in a way, dangerous thought as all thought that calls a constraining limitation into question, because it puts the familiar coordinates into danger. There's a more direct sense of a danger where you say you're in some sort of physical danger, but I don't think that when people refer to I don't think the first thing that people mean when they call a thinker dangerous is that he's putting physical existence into question. Although it may be that a consequence of the new models is, for example, has a geopolitical aspect and therefore a military aspect, and therefore the possibility of physical confrontation and death. The primary reason people call ideas dangerous, I think, is because they call into question one's basic coordinate system. In politics, that can be our definition of what it is to be human, our axioms about what matters to us most in our political philosophy, whether it's human rights or human dignity, whether it's individualism. And the more compelling, well, you can say two things about this. The more compelling a thinker's arguments are, the more dangerous that thinker is, because he has the possibility of taking people away from one path and leading them onto another one, but also the more persuasive. So it can be that the arguments are compelling on their own, or it can also be that the person is a good rhetorician, a charismatic and persuasive leader, and is dangerous in the sense that even though the arguments are misleading, they may mislead you down a dangerous path. So this whole theme of dangerous thoughts, dangerous ideas, and the dangerous thinker is very multi-dimensional. It's multifaceted. We have to remember. So, all right, if someone looks up Alexander Dugin and sees a picture of him standing with a rocket launcher and talking to Ahmadinejad and talking about the end of the world, they'll say, all right, he's a dangerous thinker because he wants to usher in the apocalypse. But we shouldn't forget that Socrates was regarded as a dangerous thinker. He was regarded as a corrupter of the youth, and he was put to death by a jury of his, let's call them peers, even though if they voted the way they did, they're far from being his peers in the higher sense. So all philosophical thought is dangerous to the extent to which it goes past the limitations that define a political community, I would say.
Mm-hmm. And specifically Dugin, why do you think people claim that he is a dangerous thinker?
They claim he's a dangerous thinker because there are stories of his influence on Putin and on the Kremlin. So if he had no influence, if there were no grounds on which to think that he had any influence whatsoever, if there were no stories of the Russian government having acted in his defense when he was expelled from Ukraine for his anti-Ukrainian comments, if there was no evidence of any connections that he had with party ideologues, if there was no plausible mapping between his theories of multipolarity and Russian national policy statements on multipolarity, then you might think he's a harmless thinker, no matter how dangerous the ideas seem to be. But the fact that his ideas are coherently and consistently anti-liberal, so therefore they pose on a theoretical level a threat to the deepest held commitments of the Western world, let's say, and added to that the additional fact that he has some sort of political influence, whether it's indirectly by influencing party platforms, like he's said to have done with the Communist Party, the new Communist Party of the Russian Federation, by bringing in some traditionalist themes there, or as I say, with the doctrine of multipolarity. When you combine the dangerous ideas with some proximity to political power and political influence, then you can see some of the reasons why people think of him as dangerous. But it's also that he does combine in his person functions that at times are distributed across numerous people. You can imagine a scenario, Plato wrote about it, and we've encountered it in the history of political thought more than once, where you have a scribbling madman generating the ideas and somebody else playing the role of implementer or of propagandizer, ideologue, or the embodiment to some extent of those ideas. Well, Dugin embodies all of these functions and more in himself. He generates the ideas, but then he may generate them philosophically, but he also propagates them ideologically and activistically. He does so knowingly and with a theory of his own self-activity. So those are some of the reasons I would say he's dangerous. He combines thinking with activism. He combines theoretical prowess with proximity to political power. And he is anti-liberal, whereas the Western world identifies itself to a certain extent with as his enemy, and therefore him as the West's enemy.
Right. And I think it was your first video in your Millerman Talk series that you give 3 reasons why it's important to know Dugin's ideas. If you recall those, could you go over them?
I probably said something along the lines that if we declare somebody to be our enemy, so we just say, this person is our enemy, then I would say it's incumbent upon us to know our enemy. We benefit from a knowledge of our enemy's coordinate system. We benefit from a knowledge of their playbook. That seems to me self-evident. It may not be. I probably gave the analogy there that if you're going to be playing a chess match with somebody and you have access to that person's strategies and tactics and past games and basically everything you can learn about them and about how they encounter their opponents, it seems like it would be a dereliction of duty not to access that material. So the first reason is because you should know your enemy.
Mm.
I also think that you can learn from your enemy without giving up your commitments. So here's an example of that. A software company or some company that relies on computer technology may hire hackers to try to hack its systems, not because it wants to undermine its own systems, but because the exposure of flaws in its systems can help it to reinforce or fortify those systems.
Mm.
So you want to know your enemy because you want to be well prepared to tango, to wrestle, to do whatever, or to destroy the enemy. You also want to learn from your enemy about your own weaknesses, but we can't lose from sight the noble and legitimate, defensible motivation of wanting to learn from your enemy something that transcends the relationship between friend and enemy, something that the declared enemy may have learned about the truth of some matter. And I put that under the umbrella of a liberal education. A liberal education, an education that frees one from opinion and liberates one towards knowledge, let's say, or that frees the mind from constraints and brings it into the light of the truth, cannot rest content with the idea that all of the truth is on its side. It must be willing to find the truth wherever it lies. And often that'll be with friends, with neutrals, with enemies. It may be where it's least expected, where it's most expected. But there's more between heaven and earth than lies in our philosophy. And that means that sometimes we have to go consider the philosophy or the ideology or the thought systems of others. So I think that the study of Dugin is defensible on all of those grounds, whether it's a policymaker trying to understand Russia as a geopolitical enemy, whether it's somebody who wants to fortify our systems against their ideological, technological, institutional, and moral weaknesses, or whether it's somebody who's driven by a desire to have a more complete understanding of the human condition. I don't see what would take Dugin off the table for any one of those aims.
Right. I really like that. And if I were to rephrase it, like the first one is, the Sung Sums, know yourself, know your enemy, win 1,000 battles. The second one is sort of like the devil's advocate, stress test your own idea. And then the third one reminds me of Ken Wilber's quote, nobody's smart enough to be 100% wrong, right? And you can learn something from everyone. And I think you said this in one of your videos, is that, liberal arts is the art that liberates your mind. So yeah, I think those are three very valid reasons. Just before we get into, because I really want to do a deep dive into Dugin's thought, but before we do that, just as one remaining question regarding the sandbox. So let's say we want to look at different ideas, whether it's Dugin or ISIS or neo-Nazis. In order to philosophically sandbox an idea and have that distance, it's really a skill set. It's like an art form, a skill set. Maybe it requires a certain temperament or level of intelligence. And just from my experience, and this is not a value judgment, but a lot of people don't have the desire for the examined life. So if you release these ideas into the noosphere, or the localized noosphere, it can infect people in ways, and in, let's say, unhelpful ways, or that's at least a counter argument to this. And do you think there's any merit to that, or what's your thoughts in that argument?
I do think there's merit to it, but we have to see exactly where the merit lies. If we sandbox or entertain certain ideas to see what we can learn from them, as I say, about ourselves and about our interlocutors and our partners, friends and enemies, if we entertain those ideas and they risk spilling out to people who don't have the approximate or the appropriate distance from them, yes, there is some risk of presenting, let's say you give the devil his hearing, but you don't want to give him such a fair hearing that people turn to him rather than to the alternative, so to speak. But we have to, there are a lot of different elements to this picture, I think. So, for example, where is the most appropriate place to entertain such ideas? I don't say that every mass media channel, every newspaper should be shouting it from the rooftops. Hey, let's all give neo-Nazism a serious hearing. Everybody stop what you're doing and let's now give child molestation a serious hearing.
Yeah.
No, that's not at all naturally what I'm advocating. But there are places where it makes sense to give things a fair hearing. A think tank, for example, seems like a place where you would want to entertain a broad range of ideas. That's an institutionally defined place. Now, there are think tanks whose job it is to crank out policy given a certain set of axioms, but nevertheless, a think tank seems like a place where you may play with a variety of axiom sets. The university, not completely, not everywhere and in every department, not at all times, but at some pockets of the university at some times seem like appropriate places to be entertaining a range of ideas about politics, human life, morality, and all the rest of it that go beyond our orthodoxies. Now, for example, a first-year course on political science, in my view, should have some element of civic education built into it before students learn about all of the alternatives in a sandbox style manner. They should know something about our own system, our own institutions, our own ideas, the reasons for their existence, and so on. So a solid grounding in our own system as preparation for the consideration of alternatives. On the other hand, a fourth-year course or a graduate program in political science that begins to introduce ideas that now, unfortunately, I would say are introduced at the first-year level, alternatives to liberalism, even before we have a solid understanding of our own traditions. Well, at the fourth-year level or graduate level, there should now be a willingness to engage not only with Mill and Marx, but also with Heidegger and Nietzsche as thinkers of the right, not only with the tolerable others that we like because they remind us of our liberal guilt, but also the other others like Russian conservatives and Islamic fundamentalists. In other words, once we have now found a place where it makes sense to consider other ideas, which, to repeat, I don't think it makes sense to do everywhere and at all times, but there are many pockets, institutional pockets, where this type of behavior is expected and makes perfect sense. Once we do that, then we should do it. It may come with disclaimers. Don't get, if I do think professors, for example, owe to their young, impressionable students a word of caution that the ideas they're about to present may excite them, may very much infect them or take them over. They may fall in love with these anti-liberal ideas or whatever they happen to be. And that type of warning would not be meant to, how would you say, to discredit the ideas, but there is some moral obligation or responsibility a professor has to his students, at least to let them know that they're getting into this domain where they may want to practice a little bit of distance from the consideration of the ideas to falling under the spell of those ideas. But no professor or educator in this higher sense has it in their power to keep a student from falling under the spell of an idea that is fascinating and that grabs one by the heart, by the soul, sometimes by the throat. So yes, there's a responsibility, but it's not perfectly within the control of the educator. There should be some acknowledgement of the risks, but with no watering down of the content and with no trying to keep students who entertain those risks from the rewards of whatever they might happen to discover. There's just an uncertainty and an unpredictability to the outcome, but the cost of not engaging in the experiment is much higher than the cost of not conducting it. I mean, like, sorry, the cost of not doing the experiment is much higher than one or two people get red pilled by Nietzsche. Okay, what are you going to do? Stop teaching him? Stop exposing students to the potential of a critique of traditional morality? What's needed is professors who can do that sandboxing in a way that understands what students desire, why they are fascinated by ideas, and that can basically responsibly take them through that, not paternalistically, but responsibly. So there are too many professors who either say, we're not going to teach, we won't even read Heidegger because students are going to become Nazis. I'm sorry, that those people with that type of attitude have no place at the university or in any company of educated, intelligent people. So that's my view. There are risks, but they can't be avoided. There are risks to crossing the street as well. But the mind has many streets it has to cross, and it has to do that with its eyes open.
That was very well put. Okay, so let's go into Dugin. And my first question with him, and this might be too much to ask, but the whole idea of an elevator pitch, right? Describe what you do in the duration of an elevator ride. Could you do your best to describe Dugin as an elevator pitch, his philosophy?
He is a political philosopher, an ideologue, an activist who opposes liberalism politically and philosophically and elaborates an alternate system of political philosophy to it that is neither left anti-liberalism that we know, like the communist intellectual tradition, nor right anti-liberalism familiar to us from fascism and its alternatives. I think that would probably be my best effort. So he tries to go beyond left and right opposition to liberalism as communism and fascism to elaborate some philosophical political alternative to the dominant political ideology today.
Great. And he has something called the fourth political theory. Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yes. The basic idea of the fourth political theory, partly I just said, but we can elaborate on it, is that the 20th century had an ideological, one of the characteristics of the 20th century was an ideological struggle between liberalism and communism and fascism. Liberalism, he calls the first political theory, communism, the second political theory, fascism, the third political theory. And he recognizes that they have their subdivisions and their shades. So he says that by the end of the 20th century, liberalism had emerged victorious. It no longer faced fascist opposition as a systematic and politically relevant political alternative. And with the collapse of the communist world, Fukuyama's end of history thesis, liberalism now stood largely unopposed in the ideological domain. But if you, for any reason, want to oppose a liberal political philosophy, and there are a variety of reasons why countries and individuals might want to do that, some political, some philosophical, for example. And if it's no longer fitting, if it's no longer appropriate to oppose liberalism either from the second or third political theories, because they've been refuted both historically and theoretically, then what do you do? If the three political theories exhaust the possibilities, there's nothing left to do. You've reached the end of history, the end of the relevant options in the domain of ideas about the nature of human and political life. So he assessed that situation and said, any reversion to communist political theory, like leftist political theory, and any reversion to fascist or fascist-like political theories is going to be totally inadequate, philosophically and historically. So the first thing that we do in this situation, therefore, is declare the fourth political theory. By declaring the name, just saying the name, the fourth political theory, in terms of this analysis that I just gave, you now create an intellectual space outside of this constraining three ideology model, and you can now breathe more freely and begin to see what the fourth political theory must be if it's going to be a systematic, philosophically coherent, politically relevant alternative to liberalism that's neither communist nor fascist in character. And so in his book, The Fourth Political Theory, the 2012 version that was published in English, he starts to say that that's the negative significance, so to speak. That's the rejection of its identification with liberalism, communism, and fascism, the creation of a you might say sandbox, but the creation of an intellectual space where you can now breathe freely. Well, he also begins to think about what the content, the positive content, would be of that theory. And he offers a variety of approaches to that question. So, for example, he says, well, one way we might think of the positive content of the fourth political theory is that it's going to contain bits and pieces of liberalism, communism, and fascism. It's going to be a patchwork creation of elements of pre-existing political theories. And he doesn't just say that, he gives an example of how that operation would run. So, for example, he says the following: if you see liberalism, communism, and fascism as coherent ideologies, so they contain a variety of aspects and elements, but those aspects and elements hang together in some coherent way, he says we can try to identify some core feature of those ideological systems, remove that core feature from the intellectual structure, and let the other elements of that structure sort of fall to the ground. Now that they've lost their magnetic charge or they've lost the piece that holds them together, they fall to the ground as elements or scraps available for the taking. They are no longer like the body parts of this ideology. They're now disembodied elements that can be put together for something else. So in his book, he says that in communism, he rejects the thesis of the linearity of time. So history being unidirectional, a certain notion of time and a certain notion of materialism can be their key features for the communist ideology. So if you reject them, the other pieces of the analysis, for example, the critique of capitalism, remain available, but ideologically have lost their ideological charge. In fascism, he rejects racism, so the element on race and on the superiority of race, but he acknowledges that certain thinkers in the third political theory thought about ethnicity and peoplehood in a way that is non-racial, but could be valuable for a political theory. So he rejects racism, but accepts the concept of the ethnos as relevant. And in liberalism, he rejects the concept of the individual, but accepts the notion of freedom. So he says that's one approach to the fourth political theory, is piece together these ideologically neutralized elements of the other theories. And he offers a variety of other suggestions about what the fourth political theory could be. The deepest of which, to use his own words, the deepest foundation for the fourth political theory, his experimental formulation of it in 2012, was that it's going to be based on the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. That's an idea that he developed over the next few years in a series of books. And that's distinct from the approach I just outlined of borrowing elements from the three political theories. They belong to modernity, whereas he believes philosophically a rejection of modernity, which you can accomplish through Heidegger, he thinks, gives a much more solid philosophical ground for the elaboration of an alternative to liberalism and its better known competitors.
So could you go into that a little bit about his use of Heidegger and Design, and instead of like focusing on the individual or a collective or something like that?
Yes. So what do we take as the key unit of political analysis? We may take, for example, the race, the nation, the country, the class, which is what he says is the key unit of political analysis in communism, class-based analysis. It can be the state and so on. In liberalism, it's the individual. But he says that Heidegger, in Being and Time, but in his whole corpus, shows us philosophically that there is a more fundamental X, a more fundamental something, over which all of these other identities are built as superstructures of some kind. They're acts of interpretation about some more fundamental entity or some more fundamental being. And so Heidegger's analysis of ourselves as that more fundamental being circulates to an extent around the notion of Dasein, the analytic of Dasein, as that being for whom being is a question, which is distinct from beings in the world, like the things that you see around you. So a human being is not just a thing in the world, like a cup of coffee or, again, whatever else you see around you. A human being is of a different sort, of a different kind. So Heidegger gives that intuition or that insight, full force of philosophical articulation in a way that relates it to the history of philosophy and to the future of philosophy. And for Dugin, that is just the richest resource for an elaboration of a political philosophy. Because if you take the individual in liberalism, the class in communism, and for example, the race in fascism, so you now have liberalism, communism, and fascism represented, he sees those as differing, let's say, horizontally. Those are alternate options for your definition of the relevant political unit that are all on the same plane because they all derive, he believes, using Heidegger's analysis, from the axioms of modern philosophy. And Heidegger has this criticism also, surprisingly, in his Black Notebooks, which a lot of people have the impression of that you look to the Black Notebooks as a smoking gun for Heidegger's anti-Semitism and Nazism. But in fact, the Black Notebooks give a very rich philosophical articulation of the view that the Nazis were as philosophically misguided as liberals and the communists because of how they interpreted human being. So Heidegger gives us access not to an alternate understanding of humanity that lies on the same horizontal plane, in other words, that shares the same mistaken axioms about human being and about reason and time and so on, but he takes us a level or two deeper. And in fact, he takes us so many levels deeper, he believes, and Dugin believes and Heidegger believes, that they get to the source of our range of self-conceptions about what it is to be human. So the beautiful thing about Dugin drawing on Heidegger is that he gets to satisfy simultaneously his very real philosophical urge not to operate with mere ideology or some given set of axioms, but to take things down to their deepest foundation, and at the same time to have a political corollary to that philosophical discovery or to that philosophical emergence.
I like that. Yeah,
and let me just add. So he had, although he began to talk about Heidegger, let's say in the Fourth Political Theory in 2012, since then he wrote in Russian a number of books on Heidegger, one of which has been translated into English. It's called Martin Heidegger, The Philosophy of Another Beginning. It presents an overview of Heidegger's thought in a specific way to emphasize what Dugin thinks is most important about Heidegger, changing in a way the way that many Western English language scholars think about Heidegger. And his second book, second, third, and fourth books are untranslated, but the second one is called Martin Heidegger, The Possibility of Russian Philosophy, where he uses the coordinates of Heidegger's philosophical system to explain and to do this kind of experimental examination of whether there might be something called something distinct about Russian people, about Russian civilization, and therefore about Russian philosophy as well. So they're very good, well thought out, well executed works, and I hope that before too long, at least the second volume gets translated into English. But even the first one is a good place to start for people who want to go a few steps deeper into Dugin's use of Heidegger.
So I find that fascinating. I don't know what you would call it, but sort of the axiomatic foundation of each one of these sort of political theories, where I'll repeat it again, where liberalism, you have the individual, communism, you have the class, fascism, you have the race, and this fourth theory, you have the Design. So I just want to return back to liberalism and why Dugin sees it as being problematic, because as you said, or Dugin thinks that fascism and socialism or communism have been refuted, and you can probably make the evolutionary argument that that's the case as well, because they sort of, died out or lost steam. But liberalism on the surface seems like it's going strong right now. So could you maybe talk about why Dugin thinks liberalism is so problematic?
He has a few reasons coming from a few different levels, so to speak. One reason, I think, is that there were many, let's say, right-leaning Soviet dissidents who, with the collapse of communism and the liberalism of Russia in the 90s, just were not satisfied. It's not a model that grows naturally out of the Russian tradition. It's something that they may have experienced as a forceful, that many of them may have experienced as a forceful and unwanted imposition, as something that robbed them of their most valuable traditions and the most valuable or cherished elements of their identity, and tried to reconfigure everything in terms of some crazy cowboy capitalism and importation of foreign models. So at some basic like anti-colonialist perspective or mentality, it may just be a rejection of a foreign import. He was, I think that describes part of the reason. That's like the simplest level in a sense. But now you go on further and further and further, and you say, what is liberalism as a set of ideas about human nature? What is liberalism as a set of ideas about what's most valuable and most important in human life? What theories of morality did it reject as part of its self-constitution? So for anybody who finds the rejected theories appealing, liberalism is going to become more suspicious. And Dugin may reject some of those elements in the name of a deep religious tradition, or a deep, let's say, national or civilizational tradition, deep linguistic tradition, literary tradition, a different view of the hierarchy of human excellence. But different thinkers can reject parts of liberalism for the same reason, but in the name of something else. So Leo Strauss, somebody I have learned a lot from and deeply admire, he was suspicious about modern liberalism because of how much of classical political philosophy, Plato and Aristotle in particular, it rejected in the course of its self-configuration. And if you think that there's something eternally and deeply valuable about Platonic philosophy, then you'd see its loss in liberalism as a loss for all of humanity. And there's some of that in Dugin also. So one aspect, the imposition of liberalism after the collapse of communism in Russia, experienced as a unwelcome moral invasion. Another one, if you're philosophically inclined towards something like Plato, which Dugin is, and you see liberalism as being hostile towards Platonism, which it is, then that's another element of the threat. But I think that probably the deepest reason for him now, just based on my research, he's not answering for himself, I'm answering just based on the research I've done. He's repeatedly stated after his encounter with Heidegger that the deepest criticism of liberalism is its identification of the human being as an individual. And that constraining act, that act that takes this broad, how should we put it, the broad experience of being a human being and narrows it into the particular interpretation of being an individual, is basically a crime against humanity, especially when seen in light of Heidegger's history of philosophy. That's where, for Dugin, this act of interpretation is best seen and best understood. So if somebody today is an anti-liberal, and they think that bearded women at Eurovision and transgenderism and all of these types of modern liberal phenomena are objectionable, but they oppose to that something that is not necessarily deeply philosophically sophisticated, Dugin doesn't go all the way with that. He acknowledges the rejection of liberal morality to a certain extent, but wants to ground it in a basic understanding of human being. And he thinks that Heidegger is the key to that basic understanding. So I would say it's very much multifaceted. And the war against liberalism, from Dugin's perspective, even though I just said in its best case, the true battle between heaven and earth comes with our philosophical level, he does allow for the war against liberalism to happen on a variety of planes. That's why, for example, in his online universe and all of the websites that he's connected to, among them, there's a website on Platonism and on Neoplatonism, which fights the battle basically at the level of angels and demons. But there's also his sites on geopolitics, which will fight it on the geopolitical level, and his other propagandistic sites that fight it at the level of everyday mass media. So there's a lot about liberalism that he doesn't like. And it revolves, I would say, largely around the interpretation of what it is to be an individual.
Yeah, can we touch on that? The problematic aspect, or what Dugin thinks is the problematic aspect of being an individual, because, like, currently a guy like Peterson, he's beating on that drum, right? And he says that if we don't become individuals, then we risk slipping into this collectivist horror show that we've seen with Nazism and Stalin. So why does Dugin think, if you can kind of expand on that a little bit more, why do you think that's problematic?
Well, I have to say a few things. He rejects in some of his writings the split or the dichotomy between the individual and the collective. You might think that those are only your two relevant options. Either you're part of some collective, which has the upper hand on your analysis, or you're an individual, which has the upper hand on the analysis. But in fact, he thinks that those types of dichotomies, in part like the dichotomy between right and left, and even to lapse back into some Heideggerian analysis here, between subject and object, that those types of divisions, there's a level at which you can go not just either to one or to the other, but beyond both of them. And not just arbitrarily beyond them, but in a way that bears some philosophical analysis. So that's the first thing I can say. His rejection of individualism does not automatically imply his collectivism, because he's on record explicitly analyzing and rejecting the dichotomy between individualism and collectivism. For example, for those people who want to know the source, there's an English volume called Heidegger in Russia and Eastern Europe. And Dugin's essay in that volume is a good place for his rejection of this division between individualism and collectivism. That's number one. Number two, I'm not an expert on Peterson, far from it, but his willingness to consider Jungian archetypes and other things like that complicates his sense of the individual in a way that potentially, I'm not saying it does, but it merits exploration, potentially brings him in the direction of Dugin's analysis of human being a little bit closer. Because besides Heidegger, Dugin draws on other thinkers, Jung included, to give a deeper and richer sense of the complexity of human existence. He thinks that if we just take the view that we are calculating beings or rational animals, that we're utility maximizers, or any of these traditional formulations, that leaves far, far too much unaccounted for. That is a cheap reduction of blossoming complexity of human life into something far too simple and misleading. He does think that the definition of the human being as primarily rational has undergone a shift in a very consistently a logical shift in recent decades, because once reason was put at the forefront of human identity, so for example, once in the name of reason, you fight against external hierarchies like priests and kings and so on, you're now faced with an internal hierarchy that you must also dethrone. So the dethroning of external leaders or external authorities redounds back on oneself, and reason has to become displaced, so that you no longer have a vertical structure in the human soul, but something like the rhizome, something where everything is equivalent to everything else, and reason does not only take a backseat, but who knows where it goes, out the door and disappears altogether. So that deconstruction of our internal hierarchies is perfectly correlated to the deconstruction of external hierarchies for Dugin. So both Peterson and Dugin have some better understanding of hierarchies of competence than their critics do. I understand Peterson talks a lot about that, right? That primarily you would want to have hierarchies of competence, but they can degenerate into hierarchies of power and oppression and so on, but that you don't therefore want to reject all hierarchies. That's consistent with Dugin's view. But already we're in the domain, if we're talking about hierarchies of competence, there may also be, like Dugin has a video, hierarchy of national heroes, where now you're not just talking about all competent people being equivalent across all human activities, but for example, an extremely competent hockey player and an extremely competent poet or philosopher, they're not just at the top of their hierarchies, they themselves are stand in a hierarchical relationship to one another. Poets and philosophers rank higher on the hierarchy of human existence and the hierarchy of national heroes than sportsmen do, or than illustrators do, or than laborers do. You see? So it would be worth doing a more sophisticated analysis of Peterson's view of the individual and Dugin's view of the alternative to liberal individuality. But they both try to bring in some depth and some dimension to what it is to be human that was lacking in the previously predominant alternatives.
Right. And Peterson talks about the logos, right, and the spoken word, and the Stoics, who I'm more familiar with, really emphasize on the importance of aligning yourself with logos. And Dugin talks about something called the dark logos. And when I was researching Dugin for this conversation, I came across this quote that kind of blew my mind, and I'm going to read it, and I want you to comment on it. So here's Dugin. Chaos can think. We should ask her how she does this. We have asked Logos. Now it is a turn of chaos. We must learn to think with chaos and within the chaos. To make an appeal to chaos is the only way to save Logos. Logos needs a savior. It cannot save itself. End quote. So I was like, whoa, what's going on here? Could you talk about that?
Yeah. So the good news is that some of Dugin's analysis of logos and chaos is starting to become available in English. I've done some translations that are going to be published by Arctos, I hope, in the coming year. And Dugin has a series of lectures that he gave in English on a book series he has that deals with this topic. So some of the information is starting to become available in English. But let me tell you a few of the basics. Dugin's view, which he began to develop in this book, In Search of the Dark Logos, is that we're most familiar with the history of philosophy that is Apollonian, that sees logos as light, truth, reason, order, coherence, conquering darkness, confusion, chaos, disorder, and all the rest of it. But through his readings and through his personal experiences, which at times, to the extent to which I've read about them, seem to be borderline mystical experiences or experiences of an initiatory sort, like initiation into mysteries untold. Those types of experiences and that type of reading showed him that there is an alternative to the Apollonian model of reason, truth, understanding, and light. That, for example, is familiar to mystical literature, where you talk about the darkness as being more fundamental than the light as emerging from the darkness, and a mystic who's on his way to an encounter with the divine would do well to go one step beyond the light, if he ever gets to that point, into the darkness. So the dark logos for Dugin is an alternate model to the relationship between the human soul and the fundamentals of reality that is alternate to Apollonian model. And there he begins to identify it with Dionysus, with Dionysian way of thinking. Now, he calls In Search of the Dark Logos the precursor to a multi-volume set that followed called No'o Machia. No'o like nous, and Machia like battle or war. No, Machia is the battle of the intellects, or the war of the intellects. And in that work, especially in the first few volumes, he sets out a model of 3 logoi. So if In Search of the Dark Logos, he was beginning to oppose a Dionysian logos to an Apollonian one, by the beginning of the No'omachia series, he had identified a 3rd logos, Cybele or Kybele. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Cybele. And each one of these 3 logoi has its own understanding of what chaos is, its own understanding of the relationship between chaos and logos. So if you are somebody who sees chaos as the collapse of order is primary and chaos is the collapse of order, it would seem weird or strange to talk about looking to chaos for salvation, or to look to chaos as a savior for logos, or however he put it in the passage you read. But in terms of a Dionysian or a mystical model or alternative to the Apollonian view, chaos is the matrix from which order arises. It's not what follows the dissolution of order. It's what precedes and includes the constitution of order. So chaos is for him a multivalent term because it changes its meaning depending on which logos system you're talking about, as of course does the word logos itself. So this is a very rich part of his thought that I just can't wait really to have those books translated. I may undertake to translate them myself. It helps, as I said, that some of it is beginning to show up in English, but he is very much a Dionysian thinker, but one who has started to map out some of the relevant alternatives. And in this series, No Machia, the first few volumes, as I say, do the theoretical work of laying out what he thinks these three logoi are, how they operate, what their subdivisions are, and so on. And the remaining volumes are a noetic and logoic, so to speak, analysis of various civilizations and which of these logoi predominate in which proportions in various civilizations. So to my mind, anybody who talks about diversity, and for them, diversity means what? It means we must have more transgender, must have more sexual minorities and freely identified people, in our classrooms learning about the evils of capitalism, or have, evils of the white male patriarchy and of Zionists and of whoever else. If that's what diversity to them means, philosophically speaking, a intellectually defensible diversity, in my view, is very much laid out here in its foundations in Dugin's No Machia set. It takes seriously the idea of logos and chaos. It pluralizes them, but not arbitrarily. It expands them horizontally and vertically into a civilizational analysis. It's pretty well thought out and serious stuff. So I've always been disappointed at intellectual people who present themselves as intellectuals, often university professors and other public intellectuals, who aren't willing to scratch beneath the surface on Dugin, because even if you reject the craziest things that he's said, whatever you think they are, you don't like that he was on Alex Jones, you don't like what he said about Ukrainians, you wish he'd never spoken to Ahmadinejad, and let the end of the world be the last words that you ever hear from his lips, fine. But when you start talking about extending this multi-logos analysis, understanding of the relationship between logos and chaos, that's richer from what I can tell. I mean, I did read parts of Peterson's first book, and although very interesting, you can extend that type of analysis so much further philosophically. I don't know whether he's done so. He's got 100 million hours of YouTube videos I can't claim to be familiar with. But what I've just described to you about how Dugin sees logos and its relationship to chaos and to civilization is worth pursuing, I think, and is defensible as a version of theoretical political diversity that's much more serious than our ersatz diversity today in and out of the classroom.
Right. And it's funny that you mentioned that, because, I was talking to a few of my friends, and when I mentioned Dugin, and I just discovered Dugin like in the summer, a couple of months ago, when I was researching about Orthodox Christianity, which is what I was baptized in, and then he came on my radar somehow. But when I was talking to him with some of my more intellectually minded friends, they just like hand-wavingly dismissed him and called him like, oh, he's akin to Bin Laden or Al Qaeda or something like that. And I thought that was a pretty superficial and uncharitable kind of dismissal of him, because even if the guy is crazy, you have to acknowledge his influence on the world stage, which is what I want to, maybe if we have time, we can get into. But
yeah, can I just say something about that briefly? So the Fourth Political Theory, the first book that I translated, I started in 2011, came out in 2012. It has a chapter on varieties of conservatism. So at the time, before I knew that, you had people like your friends who say, well, isn't he basically just like Bin Laden? As I was going through that chapter on varieties of conservatism, he distinguishes, for example, like, Bill Kristol style conservatism from German revolutionary conservatism, from fundamentalism of a Bin Laden kind, and a number of other alternatives as well. And then he does the same thing for leftist thought. And when I read that at the time, I thought, oh, wow, look at this. Remember, I didn't have the many years of experience seeing how people react to him. I was approaching him then without a lot of, let's say, a lot of noise about his reputation. It was just me in his books, So when I did that chapter, I saw, look, he's giving a much richer vocabulary about political life, just even about conservatism. Look, he's already spelled out 5 or 6 different kinds of conservatism and how they relate to time. Like, are they just about restoring the glorious past? Or do they see that the future woes were already contained in seed form in the past? Are they fundamentalist in a bin Laden type, or are they neoconservative like Bill Kristol style analysis? So even then, you could see his analysis was drawing distinctions that give us a richer vocabulary. And if someone had read only those 5 pages, it would be impossible to say, oh, he's just a religious fundamentalist. Because once you've seen how he conducts his analysis, you see that he's far beyond belonging to just one of these categories, because he must be above them in order to give such an account of them and an account of the alternatives. So he has a much greater breadth than the people who try to put him into a single slot. But that tells you about the breadth of those people, unfortunately. So oftentimes there's something to be gained in enriching our political vocabulary. And my thoughts then, still now to an extent, are that he's very useful in helping us do that.
So going back to the dark logos and the different kind of understandings of logos, and then trying to map that over to his fourth political theory, and sort of this multipolar world that he sees, this world order. Can you kind of speak on that, this multipolar world order, and how he envisions it?
I can say a little bit about it. It won't be exhaustive, but so he rejects unipolarity, an America-dominated world. That's the basic axiom. And he's got various models about what multipolarity should be. Who are the main poles of a multipolar world? Like, what defines a pole? Is it a country? Is it a people? So has an analysis of that, where he thinks that he posits, and I should say too, he's always willing to hedge a little bit and say, this may not be the last word on this, but since we're starting to think along these lines, let me suggest what I think is most important. That's usually his approach. So for multipolarity, he says we can identify civilizations as poles. So we have to begin with the recognition of a plurality of civilizations and a defensible account of what a civilization is. So he has that. He develops that in his writings. So multipolarity means a plurality of civilizations, each with its own large space, each with its own geopolitically speaking large space. So it's not a small nationalism of countries that are not in blocks. It's a different model, civilizational and regional block model. He has at various times articulated from the perspective of Russia's civilizational interests, which other civilizations and blocks and countries and movements he thinks makes sense to ally with, and why not. And a simpler presentation of his ideas is just the division between land powers and sea powers, which he takes from classical geopolitics and from Schmitt and from others, and elaborates into an understanding of the fundamental conflict ranging across a variety of parameters between United States as a global force and Russia as a global force, and how that plays out in terms of both minor things not minor, but let's say geopolitical things like struggles over pipelines and over various movements, domestic and international, like what some of you may know, that he's very much up in arms with the protesters against Macron right now. That's an example of that. And also what it means at the more fundamental, philosophical, theoretical level, religious level even, about how to identify the human being and his relationship to God and so on. So multipolarity, the way that I see it is that, I think this is a fair paraphrase of Dugin. That's what I mean when I say this is how I see it, is that if you're going to recognize that human being is a blossoming complexity and not just a single reality, that you can't just identify the human being as a class, for example, but that there are a variety of potential interpretations stemming from the kind of beings that we are, then a true diversity would have that reflected not just domestically when we talk about diversity and we say we need to have more people that are different from us, but there must also be the international multipolarity is a reflection of true human diversity, because true human diversity can't be ideologically self-same. So that means that geopolitical blocks also can't be ideologically self-same. So his analysis of this phenomenon of multipolarity, again, ranges across a variety of levels. A lot of the geopolitical side of it is available in English. Philosophical side is just starting to show up. But it's when people call him dangerous, when people in the West call him dangerous, I think that his agitation for multipolarity must play a big part of that. Much more so than his speculations on Heidegger, because there are far fewer Heidegger experts roving around than there are people who can see that provoking a movement against the powers that be is dangerous. Well, Dugin is very much about building relationships with parties in other countries and with intellectuals and activists in other blocs to oppose at all of its pressure points the liberal world order as he sees it. So right now that fight is in France, and yesterday it was somewhere else, and tomorrow it will be somewhere else. And all of the actions he takes in those playing fields and all of the actions that he promotes in those theaters of war, I would say, are in the name not just of Russia and its national interests, but in the name of multipolarity.
Right. And when I was researching him for the Culture War 2.0 white paper, and mainly the foundations of geopolitics, and some of the stuff that he was recommending, the soft power attacks against America, echoed what happened with the 2016 Russian interference in the elections, American elections. So do you know much about that? About like his role there or his philosophical influence?
As concerns the 2016
elections? And concerns the potential Russian interference in the U.S. politics.
In Foundations of Geopolitics, the potential fault lines in the American body politic that can be exploited by Russian interference are discussed, but not at length. They do appear. So passages that people might find about the Foundations of Geopolitics online, those passages are not fabricated, but they are a very small proportion of that book. And I wrote on michaelmillerman.ca on my blog. I translated, I don't think it had been available before, I couldn't find it when I searched, the comprehensive table of contents, the Foundations of Geopolitics. I didn't translate the whole book, but if you look at the full table of contents, you can see that the analysis of America and the potential exploitation of its weaknesses is comparatively small. It's not enough to deduce his full-fledged interference in American political life on the basis of Foundations of Geopolitics, in my view. I can't speculate further. I don't have knowledge about what he or his circles may or may not have done, or may not be doing. But the theoretical model about the relationship between Russia and the United States is not hidden. It's not secret. You see, there's a relationship of enmity, and it certainly would make sense, given that relationship of enmity, to try to do damage to your enemy. But again, I couldn't say in any level of, like, I basically don't know. So I know more about what's spelled out theoretically than what's been implemented practically. I do wish, one of the reasons I translated the introduction to Foundations of Geopolitics is because I did want to present, when people talk about that book, I want it to be with an understanding of what else is in it, besides the one or two passages that circulate online about exploiting like race riots and all the rest of it. Of course, those are important, but so is everything else.
So we're at the hour mark, and I kind of wanted to ask you two questions. One personal and one's a little bit superficial. The personal one is, what's at the edge of your thinking right now? It doesn't have to be in regards to Dugin, but in anything intellectual. What's at the edge of your thinking?
Two things, if I find the time, there are two things that I would be reading about more right now. So the first is a continuation of my interest in mysticism, mystical anthropology, and mystical political theology, and that would be Henri Corbin. He's both a Heidegger scholar and a scholar of Islamic mysticism. I learned about him through Dugin, but his value is independent of Dugin. And just before I finished my PhD, I was reading his work on the active imagination and one Islamic thinker, and it just touched me very closely and reconnected with old passion I have for mystical thought that wasn't satisfied during my university life. So, and even right now, I was reading much more as a graduate student than I'm reading now, but the book I'm finishing is called The Eternal in Russian Philosophy. So that religious mysticism and its human and political dimension is one area that continues to be of primary interest for me. And the other one, unrelated, I would say, to political life as we've discussed it so far, but related to things like the ethics of artificial intelligence and to the future of computing technology and robotics, would be Stephen Wolfram, a mathematician, a programmer, the designer of Wolfram language, a programming language, wrote a book called A New Kind of Science about complex and chaotic and random results that can be produced from repeated iterations of a very simple program. So I read that many, many years ago and have rekindled an interest in it recently. So those would be the two things, actually. The fundamentals of computing, reading more about Wolfram's New Kind of Science, and religious mystical anthropology and political theory, on the other hand. I'm not sure where and when and at which points they relate or come into contact, but those would be the two areas of my primary interest.
Yeah, and those strike me as rich explorations. Okay, so the superficial question is, this is like a geek out question. Who would you love to see Dugin debate with or have a conversation with?
I assume that right now, the most interesting conversation that I can imagine him having about Jung and about Heidegger, about individualism and so on, would be, I think, a conversation with Peterson would be interesting, because there are enough points of shared interest, it seems like to me, but enough points of misunderstanding and of opposition, and they're both. So I thought my former supervisor, Ronald Biener, who's anti-Dugin and wrote Dangerous Minds, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the Return of the Far Right. But, I don't think that, as much as I have some positive things to say about Biener, I don't think he's up to the level of having a serious discussion with Dugin about the fundamentals. Whereas I think that a conversation between Dugin and Peterson would be well worth having. And it can be artificially staged to an extent, but it would be much more interesting to have it happen,
right.
actually.
And then there's I guess I should address it. There's this conspiracy theory floating around with this connection between Peterson, yourself, and then Dugin. Would you like to address that or disabuse it if it needs to be disabused?
People on Twitter and online love to draw connections, try to find them where they may or may not exist. So the theory was that Peterson writes about Heidegger. He's at the University of Toronto. I write about Heidegger. I'm at the University of Toronto. I write about Dugin, who writes about Heidegger. Therefore, Peterson is Natsbol, a National Bolshevist supporter of Russian fascism. The theory's interesting, but far-fetched. It's inaccurate. I have never spoken with Peterson about Dugin or anything else. Not that I would mind doing that. So there's no connection. Peterson has mentioned Dugin in a lecture before, but I don't know what he's read of his, what he hasn't read, what he thinks beyond what he might have said in the lecture. And I certainly have had no direct influence on his, as far as I know anyways. I've never spoken to him about Dugin. I have no relationship to him in that way. So it's an interesting theory, but unfortunately, there's no evidence for it.
So this was been a very fascinating conversation, and again, I'm very new to Dugin, but I definitely want to do an exploration on specifically his understanding of logos, because I didn't know that what you mentioned earlier, and that's strikes me as a very rich material. So Is there anything you want to leave the audience with, where they can find you, what you're doing, what you're up to?
Sure. So I make YouTube videos on political theory from time to time that you can find at millermantalks.ca. Some of my academic writings, which include a lot on Dugin, and a list of my translations are at my site, michaelmillerman.ca. And you can follow me on Twitter if you'd like at m_Millerman. And I'd be
Great.
glad
And
to
I
see you
recommend
there.
everyone check out his videos on YouTube. I think they're pretty well done and very educational. So I encourage you to keep doing them as well. All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Michael. And until next time, keep exploring.